What unfolds when a man's desperate admission shakes a judge's legendary calm before a crowded courtroom? On this particular morning in Providence Municipal Court, Judge Frank Caprio expected nothing more than another ordinary traffic matter. Instead, he would confront a confession so devastating that it compelled him to break his courtroom reserve in a way no one had ever witnessed. The individual standing before America's most admired judge wasn't just a typical citizen. He was Detective Michael Romano, a 15-year veteran of the Providence Police Department, a man who had dedicated his entire career to enforcing the law. But on this day he faced an accusation that would challenge everything Judge Caprio believed about fairness, mercy, and human dignity. What you're about to hear will forever alter the way you view courtroom justice. Because sometimes the most powerful judgments don't come from statutes or precedents, but from the courage to extend mercy when the world demands punishment. Yet no one in that courtroom could have predicted what Detective Romano was about to reveal. Not the prosecutor, not the defense counsel, not even Judge Caprio himself. For this was no longer just a routine traffic violation. The morning of October 15th began like countless others in Courtroom 6A of Providence Municipal Court. Judge Frank Caprio, 78 years old, yet still sharp-witted and compassionate, qualities that had made him a television icon, sat reviewing his docket. 23 cases were scheduled, mostly traffic citations, parking quarrels, and small infractions that had defined his 40 years on the bench. Frank's philosophy of justice had always stood apart. Where other judges kept a rigid distance, Frank regarded each person as a human being first, a defendant second. His guiding belief was clear: justice without compassion isn't justice at all. At precisely 10:47 a.m., Court Officer Maria Santos announced the case that would alter everything: the State of Rhode Island versus Michael Romano. Docket number 2024-8847. Failure to yield right-of-way resulting in property damage. Detective Michael Romano advanced to the defendant's podium with the deliberate steps of a man who had walked these courthouse halls countless times, but never from this position. At 42 years old, Romano carried a reputation as one of Providence's most devoted officers. He had earned 3 bravery commendations, put in endless overtime hours, and had never once received a disciplinary mark in his file. Judge Caprio lifted his eyes from the folder, and for an instant, surprise flickered across his face. He knew Romano, not just as an officer, but as someone he'd encountered at numerous community gatherings, and as the son of a man who had once served beside Frank's own father in the very same police department 4 decades earlier. Detective Romano, Judge Caprio said, his tone balancing judicial formality with quiet concern, "I must admit, it's unusual to see you standing in my courtroom." Romano straightened, his years of police discipline visible in his stance, though his eyes betrayed an inner weight he could not hide. "Yes, Your Honor. I recognize the seriousness of being here." The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, a sharp, determined woman in her 30s who had handled hundreds of traffic cases, rose to state the position of the state. "Your Honor, on the morning of September 22nd, Detective Romano failed to yield at the intersection of Federal Hill and Atwells Avenue. This resulted in a collision with a vehicle driven by Mrs. Elena Torino, age 73. Mrs. Torino sustained minor injuries, and her car incurred $2,800 worth of damage. But what the prosecutor did not yet know was that Romano had been racing towards something far more urgent than any emergency call in his 15 years on the force. Judge Caprio scanned the police report, noting that Romano had been off duty when the crash occurred. Under ordinary circumstances, the case would have been straightforward: review the evidence, assess a fine, perhaps arrange a payment plan. But the expression on Romano's face told Caprio this hearing would be anything but ordinary. "Detective Romano," Judge Caprio said again, "the report states you were driving approximately 45 miles per hour in a 25-mile-per-hour zone. That is nearly double the limit. Can you explain what was happening that morning?" Romano's fists tightened at his sides, a small but telling detail that did not escape the judge's watchful eye. The packed courtroom, full of other defendants awaiting their turn, clerks and officers at their posts, and a few television cameras filming Frank's show, fell into absolute silence. "Your Honor," Romano began, his voice controlled but strained, "I was responding to a personal emergency." "Was this a family emergency, Detective?" Romano's composure faltered just slightly, yet enough for everyone present to notice. "Yes, sir. My daughter called me." Judge Caprio leaned forward, his paternal instincts stirring. "Is your daughter all right, Detective?" Romano drew in a heavy breath, and at that instant, everyone in the courtroom could sense something profound was about to be revealed. Your Honor, my daughter Emma is 16 years old. She's been struggling with severe depression for the last 2 years. That morning, she called me while I was having breakfast and she told me. Romano's voice broke completely. The hardened police detective, a man who had stared down armed suspects in domestic violence crises, now stood in open court unable to finish his sentence. Judge Caprio immediately rose from his chair, an act he almost never performed during hearings. The act was small yet deeply meaningful. It signaled respect for the person standing before him, not just for the defendant on the docket. Take your time, detective, Frank said softly. There's no rush here. Romano brushed his eyes with the back of his hand, a motion both achingly human and painfully raw to witness. Your Honor, my daughter called me that morning to tell me she had swallowed an entire bottle of sleeping pills. She called to say goodbye. The revelation that followed didn't just stun the courtroom. It unveiled a truth about Detective Romano that would forever shape the way Judge Caprio thought about justice. The chamber fell into utter stillness. Even the court stenographer had frozen, fingers hovering motionless above the keys. Romano's words hung in the air like a heavy weight pressing down on everyone present. Detective, Judge Caprio said with gentle care. Continue when you're ready. Romano lifted his shoulders, mustering what inner strength remained. Emma told me she couldn't keep fighting. She said she was exhausted, tired of feeling hollow inside, tired of being a disappointment. She said she loved me, but she couldn't pretend to be okay anymore. Tears now shimmered in Romano's eyes, yet his voice grew steadier as he pressed on. I dropped everything, Your Honor. I bolted for my car and I drove as fast as I could. I wasn't thinking about speed limits or traffic laws. I was thinking only of my little girl, the one who used to spin around the kitchen while I flipped pancakes for her on Sunday mornings. Judge Caprio slowly removed his glasses and began to wipe them with deliberate care. Those who knew him recognized the gesture as his way of absorbing overwhelming emotion. Detective Romano, was your daughter, did you reach her in time? Yes, sir. I made it home and found her in her bedroom. She was still conscious but barely. I called 911 while forcing her to vomit what pills she could. Paramedics arrived about 8 minutes later. The prosecutor, Jennifer Walsh, now shifted uncomfortably. This was nothing like the routine traffic case she had walked in expecting. She glanced from her notes to Judge Caprio, uncertain of her next move. And how is Emma now? Frank asked, his voice leaving the robe of the judge behind, speaking instead as a father and grandfather. She's alive, Your Honor. She spent 4 days in the hospital, then 6 weeks in an inpatient psychiatric facility. Since then she's been in intensive therapy. Some days are better than others. Judge Caprio lowered himself back into his chair slowly, every movement carrying the weight of what had just been revealed. Detective Romano, he began, his voice steady but heavy, in all my years on this bench I have listened to thousands of explanations for traffic violations. People late for work, rushing to family obligations, hurrying to medical appointments. But what you've just told this court. Frank paused, scanning the courtroom, locking eyes with the spectators. The cameras captured every second of this extraordinary hearing. What you've told us is the story of a father racing against time to save his daughter's life. And I want you to know, Detective, that every parent in this room, including myself, understands exactly why you were driving the way you were that morning. If you're moved by this moment, subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful stories of justice and humanity. But Romano wasn't finished. He still carried something heavier, something that cut even deeper. Your Honor, Romano continued, voice strained, I need to speak about Mrs. Torino, the woman whose car I struck. Caprio gave him a firm nod, silently urging him forward. After the collision, after I confirmed she wasn't gravely injured, and while paramedics were treating her, I had to make a decision. The ambulance was about to take my daughter to the hospital. Mrs. Torino was still being evaluated by EMTs. Romano's voice faltered, trembling. I left the scene, Your Honor. I followed the ambulance to the hospital. I left Mrs. Torino there without explaining fully what had happened or why I was speeding. I filed the report later that same day, but I never had the chance to apologize to her in person. The admission shifted the entire case. Leaving the scene, even temporarily, was no minor infraction. It carried the weight of license suspension, steep fines, and in some cases criminal liability. Judge Caprio's face grew stern. Detective Romano, you are aware that leaving the scene of an accident is an extremely serious matter, regardless of the circumstances? Yes, Your Honor. I've worn a badge for 15 years. I know the law. But I also knew my daughter might not survive if I wasn't there. I made a choice, and if I had to, I would make the same choice again. Romano's words hung in the air, not as an excuse, not as an attempt to soften his guilt, but as the raw truth of an impossible decision. Obey the law, or save his child. Judge Caprio turned slowly toward the prosecutor. Ms. Walsh, he said evenly, does the state have anything it wishes to add regarding Detective Romano's admission about leaving the scene? Jennifer Walsh rose to her feet, though her expression showed hesitation. Your Honor, while leaving the scene is undeniably a serious offense, given the circumstances Detective Romano has outlined, the state is prepared to weigh the entirety of the situation in our recommendation. Frank gave a slow nod. And what is Mrs. Torino's stance on this matter? Has she been made aware of Detective Romano's circumstances? Actually, Your Honor, Romano cut in, Mrs. Torino is present today. I invited her to attend. A ripple of whispers moved through the courtroom as an elderly Italian woman rose from the gallery. Elena Torino, 73 years old, walked forward with deliberate but steady steps toward the front. Judge Caprio, visibly surprised, motioned for her to come closer. Mrs. Torino, do you wish to say something to the court? Speaking with a faint Italian accent that reminded Judge Caprio of his own grandmother, Mrs. Torino addressed the courtroom. Your Honor, Detective Romano visited me last week. He explained about his daughter and why he was driving so fast that day. He showed me his insurance details. He paid for the damages to my car out of his own pocket, and he offered me an apology. She shifted her gaze toward Romano. But more than that, he introduced me to his daughter, Emma. That lovely girl personally apologized for her father's mistake. Can you imagine, Your Honor, a 16-year-old who nearly lost her life apologizing to me, for her father's desperate attempt to save her? What Mrs. Torino said next completely altered Judge Caprio's perception of justice, mercy, and the strength of human compassion. Her voice grew steadier and more resolute as she continued. Your Honor, I am 73 years old. I have endured much in my life. I came to America with nothing at the age of 25. I raised 4 children. I buried my husband 3 years ago. I know what it means to face hard choices. Locking eyes with Judge Caprio, she went on. When Detective Romano struck my car, I was angry. I was shaken. I couldn't understand why anyone would drive so recklessly. But when he came to my home last week with that sorrowful yet beautiful young girl, and when I learned the truth of what happened, I realized something profound. Judge Caprio leaned forward, fully attentive. I realized that sometimes, being a parent sometimes means bending or even breaking rules to protect your children. My own father brought us to America unlawfully in 1951, because staying in Italy would have meant watching his children go hungry. He violated the law to keep us alive. Detective Romano violated traffic laws to save his daughter. At times, love drives us to actions that the law condemns, yet our hearts recognize as just. The courtroom fell into complete silence. Even the court officers, who had witnessed thousands of cases, were visibly touched by Mrs. Torino's testimony. Mrs. Torino, Judge Caprio said softly, what would you like to see happen here today? Your Honor, I want Detective Romano to understand that I forgive him fully. I want his daughter, Emma, to know that there are people in this world who recognize that she is precious and deeply valued. And I want this court to reflect the kind of mercy that strengthens our community. Then Mrs. Torino did something that startled everyone present. She stepped toward Detective Romano and embraced him. You are a good father, she whispered, her words just loud enough for the microphones to catch. Never doubt that. Romano collapsed into tears, weeping openly in the arms of the 73-year-old woman whose car he had damaged in his desperate attempt to save his daughter's life. Judge Caprio rose again, and this time his own eyes glistened with tears. Detective Romano, Mrs. Torino, what I've witnessed in this courtroom today reflects the very best of humanity. Mrs. Torino, your compassion and empathy uphold everything this court should stand for. Detective Romano, your sincerity and your devotion to your daughter reveal the kind of character that makes me proud to serve this community. Frank paused, scanning the room before continuing. But I must also address the legal matter before us. Detective Romano, you have acknowledged speeding and leaving the scene of an accident. These are serious offenses I cannot simply overlook, no matter the circumstances. The tension in the room was unmistakable. Everyone waited to see how Judge Caprio would reconcile his sympathy for Romano with his responsibility to uphold the law. However, Frank continued, justice is not only about punishment. Justice is about comprehension, compassion, and guiding people to become stronger members of society. Detective Romano, I am sentencing you to 40 hours of community service, specifically speaking to high school students about teen depression and suicide prevention. Romano lifted his head, stunned by the unusual ruling. You see, Detective, Judge Caprio explained, your personal experience, painful as it has been, can serve as a lesson. It can help other parents identify the signs of depression in their children. It can help teenagers understand that their lives hold worth, that there are people who genuinely care, and reaching out for help should be seen as strength, not weakness. Share this video with someone who needs proof that justice can carry compassion, that judges can show humanity, and that sometimes the most meaningful verdicts come from the heart. Tap like if you believe Judge Caprio made the right call. But Frank wasn't finished. In addition, I want you to work with Mrs. Torino to put together a community event focused on raising awareness about teen mental health. I want the two of you to show this community what forgiveness and understanding look like when put into action. Mrs. Torino clasped her hands together, smiling for the first time since stepping into the courtroom. We can hold it at my church. Judge Caprio, we have a large hall, and I know many families who need to hear this message. Detective Romano brushed away tears and looked straight at Judge Caprio. Your Honor, I don't know how to express my gratitude. This sentence gives me the opportunity to turn the worst experience of my life into something that could help other families. That's exactly the purpose, Detective, Frank answered. But I have one additional requirement. The courtroom grew still. I want Emma to take part in this community service project, if she's willing and if her doctors agree it's suitable. I want her to realize that her struggle, her suffering, and her survival can become a beacon of hope for other teens fighting the same battle. Romano nodded eagerly. She would absolutely want that, Your Honor. She's been working with her therapist on ways to support other kids dealing with depression. Judge Caprio's lips curved into the first genuine smile he had shown all hearing. Then it settled. Case dismissed with prejudice. Once the community service obligations are fulfilled, Detective Romano, Mrs. Torino, you've both demonstrated to this courtroom the true power of forgiveness and the strength of community. As Romano and Mrs. Torino left the courthouse side by side, already discussing their first mental health awareness event, Judge Caprio turned toward the cameras, a rare step for him in normal proceedings. What we've seen here today reminds us that justice isn't always about strictly following rules as they're written. Sometimes justice means recognizing that we're all human, doing our best in difficult situations. Sometimes justice requires choosing mercy over punishment, empathy over judgment. Frank paused, fixing his gaze on the camera. Detective Romano did make mistakes that day. He sped. He left the scene of an accident, and another person was harmed as a result. But he also saved his daughter's life. And rather than denying his errors, he admitted them. He made amends and he transformed his experience into a chance to bring help to others. The judge's voice lowered, carrying a more personal tone. As a father and grandfather myself, I cannot begin to grasp the fear Detective Romano felt when that call came from Emma. I cannot fathom the impossible choice he had, obeying the law or saving his daughter's life. But what I can picture is the bravery it took for him to stand here today and speak truthfully about what happened. Judge Caprio's eyes swept across the courtroom one last time. Mrs. Torino has shown us today the very definition of strength. She could have demanded the harshest penalty. She could have insisted that the law be applied without exception. Instead, she chose empathy. She chose compassion. She chose to see Detective Romano not simply as a careless driver who struck her car, but as a father in a desperate fight to save his child. Frank's closing words were aimed not only at the cameras but at every person seated in the courtroom. This is how communities begin to heal. This is how families endure after hardship. This is how we create a society built on compassion rather than punishment. Detective Romano, Mrs. Torino, and even young Emma have shown us that the greatest laws are sometimes not written on paper, they are written in our hearts. When court adjourned that day, something within courtroom 6A of Providence Municipal Court had shifted. What started as a simple traffic violation had turned into a powerful display of justice softened with mercy, of healing made possible through understanding, and of the remarkable strength that can rise out of our darkest struggles. 6 months later, Detective Romano and Mrs. Torino had organized 12 community programs dedicated to teen mental health awareness. Emma Romano, now 17 and still on her journey of recovery, had spoken to more than 800 students about depression, suicide prevention, and the importance of reaching out for help. At least 3 families came forward, crediting Emma's talks with helping them recognize and intervene in mental health crises within their own homes. Judge Frank Caprio continued to follow their journey, checking in on Emma's progress and attending their community events whenever his schedule allowed. For Frank, this case embodied everything he believed justice should stand for: that it should heal rather than only punish, that it should unite communities rather than divide them, and that sometimes the truest verdicts are born not from the pages of law books but from the compassion in human hearts. What began with a devastating confession that silenced a courtroom ultimately grew into something profoundly beautiful: a story of redemption, of forgiveness, and of a community discovering its own power to heal even the deepest wounds.